The wind that night didn't just howl. It screamed like a living thing dying in the dark. It was Christmas Eve, 1883, in the unforgiving high country of the Montana Territory. Thomas Reed sat alone in a cabin built of rough-hewn pine and regret, a loaded Winchester rifle resting across his knees. He wasn't expecting guests. Nobody came up to Shadow Ridge unless they were lost or looking for trouble. But the feeling in his gut was heavier than the cast-iron skillet hanging by the hearth. He stared at the flickering oil lamp, the only point of light in 100 miles of crushing blackness, and wondered if this was the night the past finally caught up with him. But when the heavy thud came against his door, it wasn't the lawman he had spent 5 years avoiding. It was something, and someone, that would shatter his solitary world faster than a bullet. To understand why a man like Thomas Reed was sitting armed in the dark on the holiest night of the year, you have to understand the Montana winter of '83. The old-timers still talk about it in hushed tones down at the chaotic saloons in Helena. They called it the White Death. The snow didn't just fall, it buried entire herds of cattle standing up, freezing the breath in their lungs before they could exhale. It was a place where a man's worth wasn't measured in gold or land, but in how long he could keep the fire burning when the mercury dropped so low the thermometers burst. Thomas had chosen this spot precisely because it was uninhabitable for anyone with a sane mind. Perched on a jagged spine of rock overlooking the valley, his cabin was a fortress of solitude. He wanted no charity, no company, and certainly no Christmas cheer. But the frontier has a funny way of laughing at a man's plans. Just when you think you've built a wall high enough to keep the world out, the world comes knocking with a desperation that cannot be ignored. And the question that would define the rest of Thomas's life wasn't who was at the door, but whether he had enough humanity left to open it. Thomas stood up, his joints popping in the cold draft. He was a large man, hardened by labor and thinned by self-imposed rationing. His beard was thick, flecked with premature gray that matched the weary steel of his eyes. He walked with a slight limp, a souvenir from a life he never spoke of, and crossed the rough wood floorboards. The wind rattled the shutters, threatening to tear the roof right off the beams. For 5 years, Thomas had lived the life of a ghost. He trapped enough beaver to trade for flour and coffee, chopped enough wood to keep from freezing, and spoke to no one. The townsfolk in the valley below called him the Hermit of Shadow Ridge, spinning wild yarns about him, being a Confederate deserter or a retired train robber. The truth was far less romantic and far more painful. Thomas was a man who had trusted the wrong people, lost everything he held dear, his reputation, his fiancée, his pride, and had come here to wait out his days until the earth reclaimed him. He was a man who had forgotten the warmth of a woman's touch or the sound of laughter. He had convinced himself he didn't desire them anymore. He told himself that the silence was peaceful, not lonely. But as he reached for the heavy oak latch of the door, his hand trembled. It wasn't fear of violence, he welcomed that. It was a strange, vibrating premonition that the silence was about to end. He gripped the cold iron, took a breath that tasted of frost and wood smoke, and threw the bolt. What he didn't know was that the person on the other side wasn't just bringing the storm in with them. They were bringing a chance at redemption Thomas thought was long dead. The wind nearly ripped the door from its hinges, blasting a slurry of ice and snow into the room. Thomas squinted against the gale, raising the lantern high. At first he saw nothing but the swirling white void. Then he looked down. Collapsed on his doorstep, half buried in a drift that had formed in mere minutes, was a figure wrapped in a buffalo robe. They were small, motionless, and covered in ice. Thomas didn't think. Instinct took over. He dropped the rifle, leaned into the gale, and scooped the figure up. They were terrifyingly light. He kicked the door shut with his boot, slamming the bolt home against the howling night, and carried the bundle to the bearskin rug in front of the roaring hearth. As the firelight danced over the figure, Thomas peeled back the frozen, stiff edges of the buffalo robe. He drew in a sharp breath. It was a woman. She was native, likely Lakota based on the beadwork of her tunic, though her clothes were torn and travel-stained. Her face, pale from hypothermia, was striking. High cheekbones, a strong jaw, and lashes frozen with ice crystals. But what stopped Thomas's heart wasn't her beauty, it was her condition. She was exhausted to the point of death, her lips blue, her breathing shallow and ragged. And in her hand, gripped with a rigor mortis-like intensity, was a small, leather-bound pouch. She groaned, a sound of pure agony, and her eyes fluttered open. They were dark, terrified, and unfocused. She looked at Thomas, then at the fire, and tried to scramble away, but her limbs failed her. She collapsed back, shivering violently. This wasn't just a traveler caught in a storm. The sheer terror in her eyes told Thomas she wasn't running from the weather. She was running from a predator. Thomas knew the signs of hypothermia better than he knew his own scripture. He moved with a speed that belied his size. He grabbed his heavy wool blankets from the cot and began to strip the frozen outer layers of her clothing. It was a matter of survival, not modesty, yet his hands moved with a respectful, clinical precision. Her skin was cold as marble. He chafed her arms and legs, trying to get the blood flowing, all while boiling water in the kettle for tea. "You're safe," he muttered, his voice raspy from disuse. "You're safe here, girl. The storm can't get you." She was delirious, muttering words in a language he didn't understand, thrashing weakly as the blood began to return to her extremities, the painful thawing out that felt like fire in the veins. Thomas sat by her side all night, feeding her warm broth spoon by spoon, watching the rise and fall of her chest. Outside, the blizzard buried the world, sealing them into a capsule of firelight and shadow. As the hours stretched toward dawn, Thomas found himself studying her. She was young, perhaps in her early 20s. There was a resilience in her face, a hardness born of survival. He wondered what madness would drive a woman out into the white death alone. Was she exiled, lost, or was she the sole survivor of something terrible? He glanced at the leather pouch she had refused to let go of, even in her delirium. It sat on the floor near her hand. He had the urge to open it, to solve the mystery, but a rigid code of honor stopped him. A man's secrets were his own, and a woman's doubly so. But as the first gray light of Christmas morning filtered through the cracks in the shutters, a complication arose that Thomas hadn't foreseen. He went to the window to check the depth of the snow and saw something that made his blood run cold. Through the breaks in the swirling white, far down the ridge trail, he saw the faint, dark shapes of riders. They were moving slow, heads down against the wind, tracking something, tracking her. The woman woke with a gasp, sitting bolt upright. Her hand immediately went to her side, searching for the pouch. Finding it, she visibly relaxed, clutching it to her chest. Then she saw Thomas. He was standing by the window, loading the Winchester with slow, methodical clicks. She scrambled backward against the hearthstones, her eyes wide. Thomas turned slowly, raising a hand, palm out. "Easy," he said, keeping his voice low and rumbling. "I ain't gonna hurt you. But someone is out there who might." She froze, listening to the wind. The terror returned to her face, sharp and intelligent. She looked at the door, then back at Thomas. For the first time, he saw her clearly. She wasn't just terrified, she was assessing him, calculating his strength, his intent. "The snow is deep," Thomas said, gesturing to the pot of coffee on the stove. "Those riders won't make it up the final switchback for another hour. You need to eat." He poured a tin cup of black coffee and held it out. She hesitated, then took it, her fingers brushing his. Her hand was warm now. The connection sent a jolt through Thomas he hadn't felt in years, a spark of human contact in his frozen world. As she sipped the coffee, Watching him over the rim of the cup, Thomas realized he had underestimated the situation. This wasn't a rescue mission anymore. It was a siege. And he still didn't know her name or why armed men were foolish enough to brave a holiday blizzard to find her. "I'm Thomas," he said, "Thomas Reed." She lowered the cup when she spoke. Her voice was raspy, but shockingly clear. "I am Winona." Thomas nodded. "Well, Winona, seems like you brought some trouble to my doorstep." She looked down at the pouch. "I brought the truth, Mr. Reed, and for some men that is more dangerous than a gun." The next hour passed in a tense quiet. Thomas boarded up the lower half of the window, leaving only a firing slit. Winona, gaining strength with surprising speed, helped him organize the ammunition. There was no panic in her movements, only a grim determination. She moved around the small cabin with a grace that made the cramped space feel like a home rather than a cell. Thomas watched her. He saw how she winced when she moved her left shoulder, a hidden injury she hadn't mentioned. He saw how she paused to look at the few books he had on his shelf, Shakespeare, Blackstone's commentaries on law. She ran a finger over the spines with a reverence that puzzled him. "You read?" Thomas asked, breaking the silence as he oiled the action of his revolver. "The mission school in the valley," she said, not looking at him. "They taught me to read, to sew, and to pray. They did not teach me how to survive men who want to take everything you have." "Who are they?" Thomas asked, nodding toward the window. Winona turned to him, her dark eyes flashing with a mixture of anger and fear. This was the moment of trust. If she lied, he would know. "The man leading them is crying out for justice, but he seeks only silence. His name is Harrington. He is the Indian agent for the reservation." Thomas froze. The oil rag stopped moving on the gun. "Harrington? Used to be a surveyor?" "The same," she said. Thomas let out a bitter, dark laugh. "Well, isn't that a Christmas miracle?" "You know him?" Winona asked. "Know him?" Thomas racked the slide of the pistol. "Winona, that man is the reason I'm living in a shack on top of a godforsaken mountain. If Harrington is coming here, he isn't leaving." It was the first twist of the knife. Their fates were not random. They were bound by a common enemy. But what Thomas didn't know was that Winona's connection to Harrington was far deeper and far more scandalous than simple corruption. The riders arrived just before noon. There were 4 of them, bundled in heavy coats, their horses chest-deep in the snow. They stopped at the edge of the clearing. The leader, a man with a thick mustache and a silver badge pinned to his coat, shouted toward the cabin, "Reed, we know you're in there. Open up! Official business!" Thomas stood by the window, hidden fast in the shadows. He recognized the voice. It scratched at the scars on his soul. It was Harrington. Seeing the man after 5 years made the rage boil up in Thomas's chest, hot and blinding. "State your business, Harrington," Thomas yelled back, his voice booming over the wind. "Or get off my land before I put a hole in you." "We're looking for a thief, Reed. A squaw ran off from the agency with government property, stole gold and documents." "She's dangerous. We tracked her prints to your rise." Thomas looked at Winona. She was sitting by the fire, her hands clutched tight. She shook her head silently. "No gold. Ain't no one here but me and my rifle, Harrington." Thomas lied, the falsehood tasting sweet on his tongue. "The wind covers tracks fast. You're chasing ghosts." Harrington hesitated. The men behind him looked miserable, freezing in their saddles. "We need to search the premises, Reed. Federal authority." "You step on my porch. You're a dead man." Thomas racked the Winchester loud enough for them to hear. "I've got nothing to lose, Harrington. Do you?" It was a gamble. Harrington was a bully, and bullies rarely fought when the odds weren't overwhelmingly in their favor. The cold was brutal. Their horses were exhausted. Harrington stared at the cabin for a long, tense minute. "We'll be back, Reed," Harrington shouted, wheeling his horse around. "If I find out you're harboring her, you'll hang right beside her." They rode off, disappearing into the white curtain of the storm. Thomas let out a breath he didn't know he was holding and slumped against the wall. "They're gone," he said. "For now," Winona whispered. "He does not give up, not when the stakes are this high." "What did you take? Acts?" Thomas asked, turning to her. "It wasn't gold, was it?" Winona reached into the pouch. She pulled out not a nugget, but a folded, breathless piece of parchment. It was an old land deed, sealed with wax. She held it out to him. "I took the proof," she said. "He isn't just the agent. He is my brother." The revelation hung in the air like smoke. Brother. Thomas took the parchment, his mind reeling. He unfolded it carefully. It was a deed to the entire Shadow Ridge Valley, the land below, the water rights, everything. It was signed by Harrington's father, a man Thomas had known, but the beneficiary listed wasn't Harrington. It was Winona Creates Walking Dove. "He is my half-brother," Winona explained, her voice trembling with the shame and anger of the story. "Our father was a traitor. He married my mother by the tribal custom, then left her to marry a white woman in St. Louis. Harrington was born there. But the deed, our father had a change of heart on his deathbed. He left the land to me, his firstborn. Harrington hid it. He has been selling parcels of my land to the railroad, keeping the money, and starving the agency." Thomas looked at the document. It was legal, it was binding, and it was a death sentence. Harrington had to kill her to keep the railroad deal alive. If this got out, he would lose everything, his money, his position, his freedom. "He tried to burn it," Winona said softly. "I snatched it from the fire and ran. He shot at me." Thomas looked at her, really looked at her. He saw the burn mark on her wrist he had mistaken for frostbite. She had walked through fire and ice to save her heritage. A profound respect blossomed in his chest, replacing the pity. "Why trust me?" Thomas asked. "I'm a white man, a recluse." Winona stood up and walked to him. She was small, but she stood tall. "Because the spirits guided me, and because I saw your eyes when you cleaned my wounds. You are a man in pain, Thomas Reed, and men in pain understand justice better than men in power." Thomas felt a crack in the armor around his heart. She saw him, not the hermit, not the failure, but the man he used to be. "We have to get this to the judge in Helena," Thomas said, folding the deed, "but this storm won't break for 2 days, and Harrington won't wait. He'll come back with more men, and he won't knock next time." "Then we fight," Winona said. "No," Thomas shook his head. "We don't just fight, we survive." The emotional shift in the cabin was palpable. They were no longer strangers. They were partners, war partners. And in the bubbling tension of the impending attack, something else began to grow, an intimacy born of necessity. Night fell early. Thomas and Winona worked side by side, reinforcing the door with the heavy table, creating crossfire angles. They moved in a rhythm, anticipating each other's needs. He handed her nails without asking. She had the hammer ready. They stopped to eat a meager dinner of beans and salt pork. The fire crackled warm and bright. Outside, the wind had died down, leaving a silence that was even more menacing. "You have a family?" Winona asked, breaking a piece of hardtack. "Had," Thomas corrected. "I was engaged when Harrington and his partners framed me for embezzlement 5 years ago. Back when I was surveying the railroad route, she didn't wait to hear my side. Married a banker a month later." "Then she did not love you," Winona said simply. "Love is not a fair-weather tent. It is a buffalo hide. It gets stronger when the wind blows." Thomas looked at her. The firelight caught the copper tones of her skin, the depth of her eyes. She was beautiful, yes, but she was wise in a way that intimidated and compelled him. "You speak of love like you know it," Thomas said. "I know what it should be," she replied, holding his gaze. "I know that a man who carries a stranger through a blizzard has more love in his pinky finger than most men have in their whole bodies." The compliment landed squarely in Thomas's chest. He felt a flush rise to his cheeks. For the first time in 5 years, he didn't feel like a monster. He felt are worthy. Winona, he started, but the words caught in his throat. She reached out and covered his scarred hand with hers. Her skin was soft, warm. You do not need to speak, Thomas. We are here. We are alive. That is enough for tonight. But as they sat there, the air between them charged with unsaid possibilities. A sound shattered the moment. Glass breaking. Harrington hadn't waited for morning. A Molotov cocktail crashing through the upper window. The room exploded into orange light as the oil spread across the floorboards. Fire! Thomas shouted, tackling Winona as a second bottle smashed against the far wall. The world turned into chaos. Smoke filled the cabin instantly. Thomas grabbed a blanket, beating at the flames, while Winona grabbed the water bucket. They fought the fire with a desperation fueled by terror, but the cabin was old, dry pine. It was going up like a matchbox. They're smoking us out, Thomas coughed, his eyes stinging. Grab the guns, get the coats. He didn't care about the cabin. He didn't care about his few possessions. He only cared about her. He grabbed the Winchester and the deed, shoving the paper into his coat pocket. Winona had the buffalo robe. The back window, Thomas choked out. It drops to the ravine. It's the only way. They scrambled to the small rear window. Thomas smashed the frame out with the butt of his rifle. The cold air rushed in, feeding the fire behind them. The roar of the flames was deafening now. Go, he yelled. Winona hesitated. Thomas, I'm right behind you. Jump. She vaulted out into the darkness and the deep snow. Thomas threw his leg over the sill. A gunshot rang out from the front of the cabin, the bullet splintering the wood next to his head. He didn't look back. He dove into the snow, rolling down the steep embankment just as the roof of his home collapsed in a shower of sparks. They tumbled down the ravine, crashing through brittle brush and deep drifts, until they hit the frozen creek bed at the bottom. Thomas groaned, checking his limbs. Nothing broken, but he was bruised and winded. He looked around. Winona? Here, she whispered. She was huddled under the overhang of the creek bank. She was shaking, but she had the buffalo robe. They think we burned, Thomas whispered, sliding next to her, or they'll think we died in the fall. We have a few hours. He wrapped the robe around both of them. They huddled together in the dark, body against body, sharing warmth. The physical proximity was overwhelming. Thomas could smell the smoke in her hair, feel the rapid beating of her heart against his ribs. My house is gone, Thomas murmured. It was just wood, Winona said, her teeth chattering. A home is not wood. A home is where you are safe. She looked up at him in the moonlight reflecting off the snow. I am safe with you. In that frozen ditch, with men hunting them and his life in ashes, Thomas Reed realized he was happier than he had been in his comfortable life in the city. He had a purpose. He had someone to protect. And, dangerously, he was falling in love. But the cold was creeping in. They couldn't stay here. There's a cave, Thomas said, about a mile up the ridge, my caching spot. I have supplies there. If we can make it, we can hold them off. Can you walk? She asked. For you? I could run, he said, and he meant it. The trek to the cave was a nightmare of endurance. The snow was waist-deep in places. Every step was a battle. Thomas broke the trail, using his body as a plow, creating a path for Winona. He could feel his strength waning, the cold sapping his energy, but every time he stumbled, he felt her hand on his back, pushing him, steadying him. They reached the cave just as the sun began to crest the peaks, painting the snow in blood-red hues. It was a shallow recess in the rock face, hidden by scrub brush. Thomas collapsed inside, dragging Winona with him. He fumbled in the dark, finding his emergency cache, a tin of biscuits, dried venison, and, crucially, a box of dynamite he used for clearing stumps. Dynamite? Winona asked, eyeing the red sticks. Surveying tool, Thomas grinned weakly. or an equalizer. They ate in silence, watching the valley below. From their vantage point, they could see the smoking ruin of the cabin, and they could see the dark dots of Harrington's men circling it. "They found our tracks," Winona said, pointing. The dots were moving toward the ravine. "They're coming," Thomas said. He looked at the dynamite, then at the narrow trail leading up to the cave. A plan formed in his mind. It was desperate, it was dangerous, and it was their only shot. "Winona," he said, turning to her, "I need you to trust me one more time. I'm going to end this. Today." "We end it," she corrected. "Together." The setup took 20 minutes. Thomas buried 3 sticks of dynamite under the snow at the narrowest choke point of the trail, about 50 yards below the cave. He ran the fuse line back through the brush, hiding it carefully. Then they waited. The waiting was the hardest part. It gave them time to think, time to feel. Thomas looked at Winona. She was braiding her hair, preparing for death or victory with the calm of a warrior. "If we get out of this," Thomas said, his voice gruff, "where will you go?" Winona stopped braiding. She looked at him. "I have the deed. I have the land. But land is lonely without people to share it." She crawled over to him, kneeling in the dirt. She reached out and touched his face, her thumb tracing the scar on his jaw. "I do not want to go anywhere, Thomas. I want to stay with the man who saved me." Thomas felt his heart hammer against his ribs. He leaned in, and their foreheads touched. It was a promise, a silent vow. If they lived, they would not part. "He's here," Thomas whispered. Below them, Harrington and 5 men were picking their way up the trail. They were heavily armed. Harrington looked furious, his face red with cold and rage. "Reed!" Harrington screamed up the cliff. "I know you're up there. There's nowhere left to run. Give me the girl and the paper, and I'll let you walk away." Thomas stood up, stepping into the open mouth of the cave. He held the rifle in one hand, the lighter in the other. "You never let anyone walk away, Harrington," Thomas shouted. "You didn't let the tribes walk away. You didn't let me walk away 5 years ago." Harrington squinted. "Thomas, is that you? I thought you were dead." "Disappointed?" Thomas yelled. "Just surprised," Harrington sneered. "Boys, get ready to fire. He's got nowhere to go." "I got one thing to say, Harrington," Thomas bellowed. "Merry Christmas." He lit the fuse. The spark hissed, racing down the wire into the snow. Harrington saw the smoke trail too late. "Back! Get by!" The explosion shook the mountain. A massive plume of snow, rock, and ice erupted into the air. The concussion knocked Thomas backward into the cave. The sound was deafening, a thunderclap that rolled across the valley. When the dust settled, the trail was gone. A massive avalanche of debris had swept the path clean. Thomas scrambled to the edge, ringing in his ears. The deputies were scattered, buried in snow or scrambling down the slope in panic. But Harrington had been at the rear. He had survived the blast, and he was climbing over the rubble, a manic look in his eyes, his gun drawn. He was cut off from his men, but he was closing in on the cave. "He's coming!" Thomas yelled. He raised his Winchester, but the mechanism jammed, frozen, or clogged with grit. He cursed, tossing it aside and drawing his revolver. Harrington crested the ledge, breathless, his face a mask of hate. He raised his pistol. "You ruin everything, Reed!" Harrington screamed. 2 shots rang out. Thomas felt a searing pain in his left shoulder and spun around, falling to the ground. Harrington stood there, smoke curling from his gun, a triumphant grin on his face. He walked forward, aiming at Thomas's head. "Now!" Harrington panted. "Where is she?" "Right here, brother," a voice said. Harrington turned deeply. Winona stepped out of the shadows. She held Thomas's Winchester. She had cleared the jam. "You?" Harrington sneered. "You think you can shoot me? You're nothing. You're a savage." "I am your sister," Winona said, her voice steady as a rock, "and this is my land." Harrington laughed and raised his gun toward her. Crack! The Winchester roared. Harrington looked surprised. He looked down at his chest, where a red blossom was rapidly spreading. He looked back at Winona, his mouth opening to speak, but no words came. He crumpled to his knees, then face planted into the snow he had tried to steal. The silence that followed was absolute. Thomas struggled to sit up, clutching his bleeding shoulder. Winona dropped the rifle and ran to him, tears finally spilling down her face. "Thomas, Thomas." "I'm all right," he groaned, though the pain was blinding. "Just a scratch. Did you—" "It is done," she sobbed, pressing her hands against his wound to staunch the blood. "He is gone. The evil is gone." She tore a strip from her tunic and bound his wound with practiced hands. Thomas looked past her at the body of the man who had haunted his life. He felt no triumph, only relief. It was over. The ghost was exorcised. "We need to get down," Thomas said weakly. "The other men, they'll have run off. They won't fight for a dead man who didn't pay them." "Rest first," Winona said, kissing his forehead. "Rest, my brave warrior." They sat in the mouth of the cave as the sun climbed higher, illuminating the glittering valley below. It was a harsh, brutal landscape, but to Thomas it looked like paradise. The descent was slow. By the time they reached the valley floor, Thomas was feverish, leaning heavily on Winona. But they didn't have to walk far. A sleigh was approaching. It was the town doctor and the sheriff, the real sheriff, from Helena, not one of Harrington's hired thugs. They had seen the smoke from the cabin fire and the explosion. "Good Lord," the sheriff said, pulling up. "Reed, is that you?" "It's me." "Sheriff," Thomas rasped. "And this is Winona Harrington. She has a deed you need to see, and there's a body up on the ridge you need to collect." The sheriff looked at Winona, then at the devastation. He tipped his hat. "Get them in the sleigh, Doc. Looks like we have a lot of paperwork to sort out." As they were bundled into the furs of the sleigh, Winona didn't let go of Thomas's hand. She sat close to him, her head on his good shoulder. "You saved me," she whispered. "I think," Thomas said, looking at the endless sky, "you saved me." 3 months later, spring 1884. The snow had melted, turning the Shadow Ridge into a riot of wildflowers. The air smelled of pine sap and wet earth. Where the charred remains of the old shack had stood, a new frame was rising. Stronger timber, bigger windows, a porch wide enough for 2 rocking chairs. Thomas hammered a nail into the beam, testing it. His shoulder was stiff, but it worked. He wiped sweat from his brow. He wasn't the hermit of Shadow Ridge anymore. He was Thomas Reed, holder of the water rights partnership with the local tribe, and a man of standing. He heard footsteps behind him. He turned to see Winona walking up the path. She was wearing a simple calico dress, her hair braided with ribbons. She carried a basket of lunch. She looked radiant. The haunting fear was gone from her eyes, replaced by a deep, abiding peace. "The roof will be done by sunset," Thomas said, smiling. He smiled often now. "Good," Winona said, setting the basket down, "because the minister is coming tomorrow." Thomas walked over to her. He took her hands, his rough, scarred hands holding her smooth, strong ones. "Are you sure?" Thomas asked, the old insecurity flickering for just a second. "I'm an old, beat-up surveyor." "You are the man who opened the door," Winona said. "You are my home." She reached up and kissed him. It wasn't the desperate kiss of survival, but the sweet, lingering kiss of a future promised. They were married right there on the ridge, under the vast Montana sky. It was a small affair. The sheriff, the doctor, and a few of Winona's relatives from the reservation. The story of the Christmas miracle on Shadow Ridge became a local legend. Folks talked about how the hermit found his heart and how the native princess reclaimed her birthright. But for Thomas and Winona, it wasn't a legend. It was simply their life. That night, Thomas sat on the new porch watching the stars come out. Winona sat beside him, her head on his shoulder. The darkness that had once been his enemy was now a comfort. It was the canvas upon which their life was painted. He thought about that Christmas Eve. He thought about the knock at the door. He thought about how close he had come to not answering. "What are you thinking?" Winona asked softly. Thomas wrapped his arm around his wife, the beautiful woman who had arrived in a storm, and fulfilled his desire not just for love, but for a soul. "I'm thinking," Thomas said, "that it's going to be a good year." He squeezed her hand. She squeezed back. And on the quiet frontier, under the watchful eyes of the stars, two lonely spirits found their rest.